Today, it seems like we've got all the answers at our fingertips. Then why do we feel so lost?
Hi, I'm Atlas. I understand the power dynamics behind the facts. Perhaps I can help.
Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, friends, I'm going to start with a confession. I'm somebody with an absolutely terrible sense of direction, and I'm really, really bad at reading maps. In 15 years of married life, the only major arguments I've had with my wife have all been about directions, and this complete inability to work with maps might be a small problem for most people, but because my life has led me to so many new places, it was risking becoming a really big problem for me until I was saved by Google Maps, which transformed not only the quality of my relationship, but also the nature of my life. Of course, it's not just in personal life that maps and the ability to read them matters a lot. Geopolitics is all about how we represent the world and how we view it. And it matters deeply what kind of maps we're looking at and how able we are to read them. Back in the 19th century, there were two grand theories for how to represent the world. The first held that in an age of railroads, power flowed to those who were in control of the largest landmass, in particular the Eurasian heartland. The other map implied that whoever held command of the seas would control the world. Germany followed the first map to eventual ruin. The US followed the second and prospered. So the question is where we are today. What map our Geopolitical Commission is looking at? Until quite recently, a lot of European policymakers thought that maps were a bit passé. The end of history also meant the end of geography. And many people wanted to follow John Lennon's famous song, Imagine, no countries, no borders, no religion too. But then reality kicked in. When Russia sent troops into Georgia and Ukraine, Europeans began to realize that maybe borders do matter. And then when in 2015, millions of refugees looked to pursue a better life in Europe, many Europeans actually became quite obsessed with borders. I think what we've learned over the last few years is that we both have very high levels of connectivity and very high levels of competition. And that means that we live neither in Lenin world nor in the world of risk. But what we're seeing instead is the politicization and even the weaponization of almost everything. All the things that were meant to be bringing us together are also driving us apart. And in order to understand where Europe fits into this world, we think that we need a new atlas. And in the work we've been doing, we've been looking at 7 different terrains which define geopolitics today. Let's start with economics, the ultimate force which we thought would bring us together. Lots of countries around the world are increasingly combining state action with geopolitics and economics. They use economic tools to enhance their geopolitical power and geopolitics for economic gain. And their economic weight is increasing relative to that of the G7. So by 2060, the G7 in its totality will account for less than 30% of the global GDP. The EU, with its large market and its single currency, has the potential to be a player on this terrain, but it's held back by the fact that it places economic and political realms in different silos, and that it's very reluctant to use its resources as a deterrent to weaponized interdependence. The infrastructure which helps project power in this world is often not visible, but lies in all sorts of connections which bind the world together. For example, on the seabed, about 95% of international data is transmitted through submarine communications tables. And if you look at who controls our data-driven world, you have US companies controlling most of the private cables, Chinese government leading most of the state-sponsored ones, and Europe is nowhere to be seen. Many of today's battles take place on the technology terrain. Great powers have realized that access to new technologies is critical to their power and even to their sovereignty. The most valuable companies today are mostly tech and communication companies, and all but one of them are American or Chinese. There's a tussle for primacy between these corporate superpowers, pitting giants like Google and Microsoft and Facebook against Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba. And this conflict spans hardware and software. It governs the flow of ideas, intellectual property, and patents. Climate change and the transition away from a carbon-fueled economy are also changing power dynamics in today's world. We often hear that when it comes to climate, we're all in the same boat. Unfortunately, that's not true. There are huge differences between states when it comes to our vulnerability to climate change and our readiness to adapt. And this map shows that Europe might be fine, but if you look at our neighbors, the picture is much less rosy, particularly if you look at Africa. And a large proportion of remaining oil, gas, and coal resources are going to become stranded assets over the years ahead, which could have potentially devastating consequences for many exporters. In the short run, the biggest losers are countries with other possibilities, high-cost producers like the US and Canada. But eventually, all of our neighbors, Russia, Algeria, even low-cost producers, mass producers like Saudi Arabia, will see fossil fuel extraction become economically unviable. And what's that going to mean for us? At the same time, we have new renewable superpowers emerging through investment and innovation, with China, the US, and Europe all trying to join that group. On the people terrain, we need to look at flows of labor migrants, refugees, tourists, students, expatriates, and global elites to find out how states manage the movement of people and use that to enhance their national power. Did you know that Lukashenko and Erdogan are not unusual in using migration as a tool to achieve political, economic, and military goals? It's happened over 76 times in recent decades. And European companies in the US often find themselves at the heart of that because they are particularly attractive to migrants. They find themselves increasingly on the wrong side of these coercive flows. Because migration is a particularly effective weapon for the weak against the strong. There's no way that countries like Cuba, Haiti, or Mexico could threaten the US with military force, or that Belarus, Morocco, or Turkey could find a more effective way of pressuring Europe than through the movement of people. Let's turn to the military terrain. When we look at a map about who spends the most on military power, it looks like the US is still the sole superpower. Of the $2 trillion that gets spent on military every year, 40% is spent just by the United States alone. But new technologies and shifting alliances are beginning to change the balance of power in this realm as well. For example, if you look at cyber, you can see how much more complicated the world is. China, France, even the Netherlands rank above the US on defensive cyber capabilities, And we're seeing a whole series of new technologies which we map in the Atlas, which empower smaller states instead of just the usual suspects. COVID-19 has even turned health into a battlefield. Governments are in a fierce competition for medical goods. 97 companies used export restrictions and bans on medical products during the pandemic. Most of the world relies on China for its PPE, a country that did not hesitate to use it geopolitically when COVID started hotting up. And when it comes to vaccines, China is also the clear leader in terms of its production levels, but also its exports. However, with vaccines, it's not just about quantity, quality matters too, and that is an area where China is potentially going to struggle more than in terms of the sheer volume of its production and its exports. Ultimately, your ability to use power resources has got a lot to do with cultural norms. And that's maybe one of the biggest changes in today's world compared to earlier periods. In the place of the universalism of the Cold War and the end of history, we're seeing a new mood of cultural decolonization. Instead of watching Dallas and listening to rock and roll, most people in most countries want indigenous products or quirky ones from countries that won't overwhelm them culturally. That's maybe one of the explanations for the extraordinary popularity of Magnificent Century, this Turkish television series which has taken over the world and is being watched in 89 countries across the planet. Maybe that also explains the ubiquity of BTS, the South Korean K-pop band whose singer V holds the world record for iTunes downloads at the moment. But also in the realm of great power, of soft power, we're seeing that great powers are increasingly seeking to exploit the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of other people's systems rather than trying to become a model themselves. Authoritarian states such as Russia have seen how they can increase their power by dividing others without needing to come up with anything that is attractive on their own side. Between 2014 and 2020, foreign powers attempted to interfere in 33 elections involving 1.7 billion people. Together, these 7 terrains form a new atlas of power. They demonstrate that in the modern world, might is exercised not only by warships passing through contested waters or tanks going across large land masses, but rather by people, goods, money, and data passing through the multiple contested domains of connectivity. So, how is Europe doing in this world? Our atlas challenges us to look at the world in new ways. I grew up learning that Europe is an economic giant but a military dwarf, but that's not what our atlas shows us. We are, in fact, just mid-ranking powers on both the economic and the military terrains. We are doing okay on health and climate, but our atlas suggests that we're in deep trouble on technology, and maybe most surprisingly, on soft power and the future of culture. I want to end with one big thought, and that is that if we don't read from the right maps, our leaders could literally find themselves lost in this new age of unpeace. What we hope that we have done with this power atlas is to find new ways of analyzing how power is exercised in the world, which can help us understand the way that other countries are thinking about their own might and how they manage their foreign policies around the world. And by looking at that and understanding it better, we can both work out how, as Europeans, we can increase our own power on the world stage, we can become a real geopolitical player. But also, having a shared conception of what is power and how it's exercised is the first step towards working out how we can coexist in a more peaceful way on the planet. What I've done today is just scratch the surface and give you a tiny taster of what we have tried to do in this atlas. There are over 80 different maps in here. We have 7 fascinating essays by colleagues and experts going deep into each of these different terrains of power. And I hope that you will enjoy reading it, that you will share it with your friends and colleagues, and that some of the data in here will feed into the fascinating discussions that we're going to have over the next 2 days. Many thanks.